Today in this navigation, we have three speakers. We have first Tina Tallon from UF. We have Julian Bessam from the Bartlett, England, and we have Hayley Boisper from UF. But first, we are going to introduce Tina Tallon. She's going to be talking about Feeling Futures, Embodying Advances. So Tina is a winner of the 2021-2022 Rome Prize. She is a sound artist, creative technologist, vocalist, educator, and arts documentary based on Gainesville, Florida, and working around the world. Her music has been performed by such esteemed musicians as Ensemble Intercontemporain, Wild Up, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing them wrong, Chalea, and the LA Philharmonic New Music Group. She has received major grants and awards from organizations such as the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, the American Academy in Rome, ASCAP, the Barlow Endowment, and La Jolla Symphony, and New Music USA. Recent commissioners include the LA Philharmonic, Guerrilla Opera, Stephen Schick, and La Jolla Symphony, and the Peabody Institute of Johns Hopkins University. Her work has been presented internationally at festivals, conferences, and workshops, including IRCAM's Manifest and LA Philharmonic's National Composers Intensive, Island Airwaves, MIT, Grafenek Forum, and the Venice Biennale, and many others. Dr. Tallon's research interests include algorithmic bias, artificial intelligence, voice technology, and digital humanities. She holds a bachelor's degree in biological engineering and music from MIT, and an MFA in composition and music theory from Brandeis University, and a PhD in music composition from UC San Diego. Her primary composition teachers include Peter Child, David Rakowski, and Leigh Line, and she studied computer music with Tom Erbe and Miller Puckett. I apologize for my pronunciation. Surely I did it wrong, but I will share this beautiful bio with you. She currently serves as an assistant professor for AI and the arts at the University of Florida. Please, warm welcome to Tina.
Thank you so much, Carla. And I also want to say thank you to all of you for letting me inhabit your space. Obviously, I'm not an architect, but I've learned so much over the past 2 days. I love interdisciplinary collaborations. I also work a lot with installation art, so anybody who might be interested in that, hit me up. And I also really enjoyed the talks this morning by Michael, Philippe, and Vera, which I feel like set the stage, so to speak, for some of the things that I'm going to talk about in my talk today. So the title of my talk is Feeling Futures, Embodying Advances in Digital Storytelling. So as Carla mentioned, I did my undergraduate work at MIT. My primary degree was in biological engineering, and then I got really burned out. And I switched to music in my senior year, which I don't advise doing. So it's really funny because I don't know how many of you get these random emails from academia.edu, but I love it when it's like, are you the Tina Tallon who wrote microRNA regulation of human embryonic stem cell differentiation? And I'm like, yeah, but it feels like a lifetime ago. So some of the work that I did in my undergraduate research involved pancreatic cancer, lung cancer, and endometriosis. And then throughout my graduate studies, even though I did them in music, I was able to pay my rent by doing pediatric diabetes research. So I'm very interested in a lot of the biochemical pathways that underlie disease progression, how we can mitigate those and mediate those. And I think throughout all of my work, one of the primary interests that I've had is actually observing underlying structures and how they lead to emergent behaviors. So if I could find one thing that brings it full circle, it's that. So after MIT, again, as I said, very burned out, didn't want to go to medical school right away. So I was like, I don't know, let's go do a music degree. That seems smart. My parents were very upset. So I went to Brandeis to study composition. Fun fact, if you put composer into DALL-E, about 80% of the time you'll get something that looks exactly like this, which is very interesting. So, yeah, I always report that as an issue because I'm the world's worst pianist, and very many of us at this point don't play piano. Although I will say part of the issue is pictures like this. Which, that was one of my first headshots. And pretty much every composer I know has some sort of silly photo with a piano. So, ultimately, yeah, it's me. I'm the problem, it's me, so to speak. Okay, so after Brandeis, I went to UC San Diego, where I did my PhD in music composition with an emphasis in computer music. And so some of my dissertation work focused on using electronic music and the ambiguities in terms of embodiment as it relates to electronic music as ways to create healing spaces for trauma, ways of abstracting the body away from oneself to place it in a space that is seemingly more objective and allows space for repair. And so I'm going to play a short instance of one of my pieces just to set the stage. And then we're actually going to move away from the music that I make and look at more interdisciplinary collaborations and applications of my work. So this piece is called Lucinia. It's for orchestra and 8 channels of live electronic processing. Lucinia, I'm actually going to bring up my notes. I've been doing this without even looking at them. So one of the things that's at the core of this work in the live processing is actually convolutional timbre transfer algorithms. And so I use this to create amalgams of instrumental sounds, vocal sounds, and found sounds, such as bird calls. And because of the nature of these algorithms, they're all reliant on each other, right? You need one to make all of them heard. And so I kind of look at this as a poetic metaphor for community action and support. And so some of the instrumental sounds are convolved with a corpus of vocal sounds that are actually related to sexual violence. I'm not going to go too much into Ovid's tale of Philomel, but that's what this is related to. But in any case, I'm happy to talk more about that process at some other time. As Michael said earlier, we're going to try to keep it light because there's a lot of heaviness inherent in this. So obviously, I took a lot of care to preserve anonymity and honor the agency of the people who are contributing their stories and their voices to this work. So I'll play you about 3 minutes of this. It starts out very, very quiet, so hopefully you'll be able to hear it. And again, this is the La Jolla Symphony with Stephen Schick conducting. we didn't get to the bird call part, but I can send you a link if you want. So during my PhD studies, I had the chance to deepen my engagement with the work of this man, who some of you may recognize, Yannis Xenakis, a Greek-French composer and architect who worked with Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier. I'm like, yeah, now everybody's like, this girl's clearly not an architect. She's butchering everything. But I know we already talked about a bunch of his work this morning, and we're going to talk about more of it. And so one of the things that I find is very interesting about Xenakis' work is actually the melding of a lot of the principles that he was working with, and obviously that he learned from Le Corbusier, with this intense fascination with algorithmic music. And so he wrote a book called Formalized Music that actually outlines a lot of his processes, which are inspired by everything from Brownian motion to various sorts of biomechanical processes to visual representation of music. His scores also are very, very interesting. And so, he often has these very smooth type of forms. So this is the Philips Pavilion at the 1958 World's Fair in Brussels. And Le Corbusier actually allowed Xenakis to design the outside of it. Le Corbusier did the interior. And it actually was a sound installation with Edgar Varese called Poème électronique. And so I think one of the things that is absolutely beautiful are these smooth forms, right, that imply so much motion, these geometries that are also stuck in this static state, right? It's as if we've frozen something at this moment in time. And so you have this frozen embodiment of some sort of robust physical process of motion. And this is also very interesting. So this is one of the sketches for Xenakis' piece Metastasis, which hilariously enough, when I walked into my first grad seminar, I called it metastasis because I'd worked in cancer research. And apparently that is not how people in the music world pronounce it. So in any case, I'll let you hear a little bit of what this sounds like. This is a sketch from much, much later in the piece, so we're just going to listen to the first minute or so. Again, starts very quiet. So what you just heard was the opening of the piece where he goes from these glissandi up to this stasis, this point of stasis, which is held out. So it's very interesting to see the form of something like the Philips Pavilion translated into this type of temporal media. Another thing that was very striking to me as I explored more of Xenakis' architectural work was this building. And so this was from a public housing complex in Rézé-les-Nantes. And also, again, in collaboration or as part of Le Corbusier's studio. And so one of the things that's particularly striking about this is the fact that I lived in this building as an undergrad at MIT. This is Simmons Hall at MIT from Steve Hull Architects. You want to know something absolutely hilarious? One of the resident advisors' names was Stephen Hall, H-A-L-L. And so we had Simmons Hall, Steve Hull, and Steve Hall all at the same time. But what I find fascinating, and as soon as I saw that picture of the building in Rézé-les-Nantes, is that this is the lobby of Simmons Hall. So I saw that and I was like, oh, damn, I know that place. And so that was really, really interesting to me and kind of, I feel like was an early lesson in form and structure and the threads that kind of build these static structures, and how they temporally engage with each other over time. Another really fun fact about living in Simmons Hall, has anybody lived there or been there to visit? You've seen it? Yeah. Oh man, I am happy to tell you about it. Okay, so here's a fun fact. So if you look at this floor plan, this is, I believe, the third floor. They have these kind of suite style living situations, and so there's usually two rooms that have an alcove and then a shared bathroom. What's really exciting about this is you'll see that there's a door that goes into the hallway. Unfortunately, I guess their door budget ran out because there were actually no doors on those alcoves. And so I'm not lying to you, because again, a lot of architects come to see it. There were so many times when people like came out of their bathrooms in a towel and there were architects there taking pictures. So in any case, yeah, I guess maybe I could have had a completely different career change. That point in time, I guess OnlyFans didn't exist then. But in any case, we did have a ball pit though. So we've got that going for us. In any case, so anyway, why am I spending so much time on Simmons Hall? This is an image of the exterior of the building. And when I first moved in, I was very intrigued by this. I'm like, okay, I highly doubt that the distribution of these colored window jambs are random. So I'm like, all right, what is the internal logic behind this? And it turns out that they are actually representing structural stress within the building, and in particular within the perforated concrete. I knew we were talking about concrete earlier. And so there you go. And so in a way, these window jambs are actually an externalized embodiment or representation of the internal dynamics of the building, which I thought was really elegant, you know, in my little undergraduate mind who didn't know anything better. But I just thought this idea of like embodied visualization of internal dynamics was in many ways related to a lot of the art that I ended up making later on in terms of multimodality and translatability. And so obviously I've grown as an engineer and an artist, but that was kind of this nascent way of thinking. And so speaking about bodies, let's talk about corpora. So, okay, we've talked a lot about building data sets and corpora over the past 36 hours or so. Maybe not quite 36 hours. We haven't been here since 2 a.m. yesterday. But in any case, one of my frustrations as someone who works with temporal media, and in particular, temporal sonic media that is often inherently divorced from language. We talked a lot about large language models today, and we're going to keep doing it. It's this idea that the body is actually taken away from it in many cases. And the body is so intrinsic to a lot of the work that I do. And so I've actually started to think of modern approaches to corpora construction, not as creating a body, but as body snatching. And so body snatching, also known as grave robbing, was a practice very commonplace during the 17th through 19th centuries. Medical schools would actually hire undertakers and people who worked at morgues to give them dead bodies for the medical students to learn from. And at some places, the medical students were actually responsible for providing their own corpses. And so this led to an underground, literally and figuratively, economy of going and digging up corpses for use in medical schools. And you could make really good money doing it. So in any case, I think this is also a very interesting way to think about the process of corpora formation, rather than bodybuilding, not like, pumping iron bodybuilding, but it's the fact that we're actually, in some ways, based upon this discretization process, this parametrization process, right? We're essentially getting rid of data. We're taking away elements of bodies. And so if we think about this on a structural level, even after these bodies are deemed useless, right, to capitalist machinery, body snatching is a process that manages to extract value from the dead, allowing, again, medical students to learn and bodies to be discretized, decontextualized, and repurposed. They would actually make sure that they could go the night after somebody had been buried so that they could actually harvest body parts after they were looking at grafts and surgeries. in some ways that sounds familiar, right, to the process of data extraction, right? This extractivist notion of how we mine data. This word data mining itself has an extractivist approach. And so it further snatches the body away from playing a central role in the human experience, relegating it to the outskirts of theory and cognition, right, by rendering these embodied modes of knowledge production and storage knowledge production, transmission, and storage to the realm of the superficial. And so here's a fun quote by a composer named Milton Babbitt, who actually worked as a mathematician prior to becoming a composer. And he often employed mathematical processes in the generation of his musical materials, though he primarily worked within the grids of like a Western classical 12-tone equal-tempered tradition, which not exactly the same thing that me or Milton Babbitt is working with there. But in any case, he says, many years ago, it came to my ears that there were people out there, non-composers, who intimated that there were those of us composers who wrote our music so that we could talk about it. I am known as a talker. He was, by the way. He was very, very verbose. And words about music concern me very much. But the truth of the matter is, there's nothing I find more difficult to do than talk about music. So I find this to be very, very telling when we think about the number of large language models, especially now, for generative text media models that rely on finding words to talk about music. And then, of course, you have this quote from Steven Pinker that says, language is the crown jewel, or rather the jewel in the crown of human cognition, which makes me feel like this as a sound artist. But also you think about like the embodiment being taken away, right? You got your emoji and it's melting. So it's, yeah, taking translation of form. And then I'm sure many of you have seen this quote, which is probably completely apocryphal. It's been attributed to like 8 billion different people. I'm sure no one actually said this specific thing, but it's writing about music is like dancing about architecture, right? Which is wonderful and concise. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance. Although I will say that I think it's fascinating that people are building generative large language models for music. And as far as I know, nobody's building a generative large dancing model for architecture. If anybody is, let me know. I feel like Igor's talk yesterday with the HoloLens and the construction processes is maybe like starting to get there, right? There's like this choreography of construction that I really appreciated. But for some reason, we feel the need to be parametrizing music within the lens of, or through the lens of language. And so some of the examples I'm gonna show today are ways that myself and my collaborators are trying to, in some ways, reclaim this abstraction of the body from these data structures. And so we're using artificial intelligence to somehow return that data back to the body. And think about ways that we can engage these tools in narratives of liberation and repair as opposed to oppression and extraction. So the first thing that I want to talk about is a project that is adaptive haptic feedback devices in large ensemble settings. So we've already heard some orchestral music today. Both of the examples I've played so far are for large orchestras. And so here's a performance of metastasis that's conducted. And again, we're just going to look at a small excerpt here at the beginning. And so this is the University of Victoria Symphony Orchestra, directed by Anshni Saba. Sorry. Okay, again, small clip just from the beginning. All right, you've now heard that twice, right? So we're gonna do a fun experiment. I want you to raise your hand right before you think the percussion should come in. I'm gonna give you a different video of this performance. And I wanna see how many of us can do this. I think it's playing. What's the problem here? How come nobody picked up on it? Because you couldn't see the conductor, right? So this deals with, again, the adaptive part here actually deals with directly with disability. A lot of my work actually deals with disability studies. I'm actually hard of hearing as a result of an audio engineering accident. And so a big focus of my work has been, again, engaging these tools in a process of repair and finding ways of returning data to the body. So this is one of my graduate students. Well, he's graduated now, named Alec Nau Concepcion Rivera. And he was a choral conducting graduate student. He took my computational music theory class last fall. First time it was being taught here. And so the students in that class came up with amazing final projects. The vast majority of them had no experience whatsoever with coding. Most people in that class had never even opened up Python, right? They didn't know any of this stuff. And so I just was so proud of the ideas that they were able to bring to bear. And so growing up, when he was singing in choirs, one of Alec's friends was actually blind. And she learned how to coordinate with the rest of the ensemble by listening to their breath. However, as you get into music that's more complex, that doesn't always work. And so Alec was like, wouldn't it be awesome if we had a tool that could do beat detection and prediction and haptically tap out the beat for a blind musician, right? So many people have various types of wearables now that give haptic feedback. And he was like, listen, most people have some sort of iWatch or Fitbit or fitness tracker. If they don't, we're also working on making low-cost haptic devices. And so he was like, this is something that could be really easily integrated. There is Braille music notation, by the way, and so blind musicians can actually learn, but they often have to memorize it, which also in a rehearsal context, if the conductor's like, okay, we're gonna start from measure 72, if you're a blind musician and you've memorized the entire piece, it's really difficult to orient yourself in the score. So we're also looking at ways of being able to take these score-informed approaches to helping people orient themselves. Okay, let's talk about the role of a conductor. Here's a little song that I'm pretty sure most of you are going to be familiar with, right? And a conductor canonically would do this. They're going to wave their arms, right? And so this is in what we call 4/4. The C stands for common time. Again, language, right? We're looking at language. It's so strange to call 4/4 common time because it automatically makes it the default, and you're like, why? Why is that the default? So anyway, there's a lot of histories to unpack here. But in any case, pretty clear, right? These points of articulation are called icti, single one, the ictus. And so computationally, that's actually probably not that difficult to figure out, right? Well, the reality is that that's not always what happens. This is much more likely what happens. So conductors have vastly different styles of interpreting and communicating musical information and sonic priorities. And so this becomes a much more computationally complex problem. And so we're trying to build these machine learning computer vision models of conductors. It involves taking the data labeling process is really, really intensive. You have to go through and, again, look at this time series. We're talking about time series. And so you have to go through, label where the beats are, human validated, because, again, the computer's going to look at that and be like, I don't know. And also look at these other dynamics. How does this relate to the textual information in the score, right, or the audio signal? And so I'm just going to show you a little bit of the variety of the ways that conductors communicate. Okay, the other problem here is that obviously, we had the 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that stays constant over the course of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. What about pieces where that thing is called the time signature? It changes, right? And so you have to change the structure of your beat pattern to be able to communicate that information. However, if you don't have the score in front of you, if you're a musician, how are you supposed to know? And so again, there's this idea of us taking these score-informed computer vision algorithms to be able to give musicians a heads up, right? If they can't see these changes. Obviously, again, they can memorize this to an extent, but if your score looks like this is Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima. right? There's a wide variety of ways that you can conduct this. There's a very different type of musical information being communicated here. And so a lot of the tools that already exist do not in any way, shape, or form capture the complexities of contemporary music or the ways that we produce and engage with it. So here's an example of that first, or rather not the first piece, not Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, but the piece in the middle with the changing time signatures called Unicornus Captivatus by Ola Giello. And so here's conductor Kathri Wynn. You can see she has a lot of circles, right? This is very common in choral conducting, actually. And then you can see she has these articulations, very sharp articulations, right? To communicate consonants and other sorts of elements. Okay, so that's kind of one style of conducting that's a little bit closer to that canonical style that we just saw. But again, there's so much more information that's being communicated there than just this temporal information. You're also telling people articulation, how you want them to be able to express that information. So here's a great example. Some of you may have actually already seen this. This is Leonard Bernstein conducting the Vienna Philharmonic in Haydn's Symphony No. 88, fourth movement. He's a Haydn fan. So, okay, let's talk about this one. Bernstein's like definitely trolling people, right? He's not actually conducting like this. This was kind of a demonstration of the fact that like if you have great musicians, like they can go on without you, right? And there's also communications within the ensemble where they're able to coordinate. But I will say facial expressions are very effective for conductors and necessary many times. And so obviously, again, like this was a zoomed in shot. He's still up there on the podium. He's still using his hands and a baton. But I will say this facial expression, every single musician, when you see this, you know exactly what to do. So in addition to being a vocalist, I was a violinist. And so if I see the conductor make that face, I know exactly how to manipulate the pressure on this knuckle of my index finger. I know how to weight my shoulder. I know how to articulate my wrist. And so there's a lot of incredibly nuanced, embodied information in something as simple as one frame of a video involving a facial feature and how I embody that and how I interact with that information. So again, I feel like we're getting further and further away from this notion of language being somehow the common denominator through which we're able to do this. And I realize people are probably gonna ask the question, well, isn't embodied communication also a form of language? And yeah, we can get there. So in any case, I also want to show you this. This is a little bit of a joke. You may have seen this going around in 2020. A VFX editor named Frederick Thalender released this on the 20th of April, 4/20 of 2020. I think we were all at a point in the pandemic where we needed some cheer. And this is supposedly Gustavo Dudamel conducting the LA Philharmonic in Beethoven Symphony No. 5. Okay, we're gonna cut it off there. So in any case, you can see that there's kind of like this ambiguity and kind of inherent context-dependent like indexicality, right, to a lot of these motions. They could be anything depending on the context. And so this is another computational problem because in a lot of pre-trained data sets for computer vision, things like MediaPipe, right, if you're doing some sort of out-of-the-box gesture recognition with these, it's really difficult because it's not specific to music and it's not specific to the way that conductors communicate information and the absurd variety of ways that they communicate that information. And so there's, we're in the process of trying to work on this and figure out whether it's sufficient to fine-tune one of these models or whether we're just gonna have to throw it all out and start from scratch because it is a really complex computational problem. So here's an example of Alec conducting a piece. We've kind of gone through this process of getting, there's no audio for this one, it's just the kind of skeletal pose estimation model here. So in any case, it's very, very interesting. You can see the blue dot is kind of what we're looking at as what we call the point of articulation or that ictus. Unfortunately, when you're trying to figure out the points, yeah, you can see it like kind of jumping around. When you're trying to figure out the points that are actually relevant for defining the ictus, it's sometimes really hard. We saw eyes, right? We're actually not getting a lot of variation in terms of the facial expression here, so we have to kind of do a heuristic approach to being able to isolate the most important component, and that would hopefully be something that we would learn for a specific conductor, so they would fine-tune their own model from the generalized model that we create. But what's very interesting is if you go and graph a lot of this information, trajectory, acceleration, velocity of just that one point, it's really not sufficient to come up with some rule-based or heuristic model. Definitely not when you start to get into things like dynamics, right, and articulation with the other hand. And so this is one of the things that we're trying to work on. And what's also very interesting, again, is you have to take that pose estimation model. You have to do both beat prediction and detection. We're also looking at taking the live audio signal and then comparing that to not only the score, but a reference audio signal. Again, when you get into contemporary classical music, especially with a lot of aleatoric music, that one's really hairy. And then, of course, giving that haptic feedback to the musicians. But there's also an interesting feedback loop that occurs there in terms of latency. That's another huge issue with this, right? You have to have extremely low latency systems, which also means that you need a very high frame rate for your pose estimation. And so it's very computationally expensive. And I don't know, we're working on this. The thing I forgot to say before I started presenting all this is all very nascent work. You know, I recently got here to UF. This is my second year here. And so I'm still trying to navigate those structures and figure it out. And, you know, we're a little bit under-resourced in music. So, you know, it's taking some time. It's taking some time to get started. So in any case, that's that project. So another project that I wanted to cover is actually one that I'm just starting to work on with a collaborator in Belgium, who was actually a flutist that I went to school with during my PhD. So we've known each other for, I guess, about a decade now. And this is almost one of the first chances since we both graduated that we're coming back to collaborate. And so she works a lot with virtual avatars and force feedback therapeutic systems. So she's assistant professor in contemporary flute performance at the Royal Conservatory of Liège. And then she's also the coordinator for the Immersive Art and Entertainment Research Lab of Haute School PSL. And I believe she also has a consultant appointment at the Corda campus as well. And so she works a lot with immersive performance environments, virtual performance environments, motion capture, and we're starting to work on these force feedback systems. So here's a little video of a project that she worked on during the pandemic. As you can imagine, the pandemic really hit musicians hard, particularly in large ensemble settings, right? Like, that's how we make music, by and large. We have to be in the same room. We have to have that embodiment in terms of those really complex communication modalities. And so this piece is called Empty Mind, and this was originally actually a composition by a composer named Wim Hendricks. And so this is kind of a virtual performance platform with a live interactive element. They essentially would pipe in, I'll show you, motion capture information to Unity to be able to control these virtual avatars with various mappings. And then they would live stream this to Twitch, and people could react with like these emoji also coming in through Unity. So it would be shown in the hall where Ina is performing, and then the virtual audience would be on Twitch. And there's also live electronic processing of the sound, which goes through a software called Pure Data, which I actually use all the time. One of my dissertation advisors, Miller Puckett, was the one who created that. And so you can see that there's a wide variety of different avatars that she uses. And one of the things she's very interested in is also the therapeutic potential of these avatars, allowing people, again, to be able to project their body into some other form, some other space, which gives a lot of potentials for, you know, healing and thinking about trauma and removing yourself from some of the embodied aspects of that. So again, works with a wide variety of different instantiations of these avatars. She's starting to do a lot of work with holograms And so you have these very, very rich data streams coming from both the suit and the gloves. So again, emojis coming from Twitch. And this is as part of a project. You can see all of her collaborators. She's part of a collective called Studio POC, which focuses on the fusion of art, performance, and new technologies. And she also worked a lot initially with like Mozilla Hubs. I don't know how many of you, have seen the kind of Mozilla Hubs, not mentality, modality, although I guess it is also a mentality, in terms of, again, trying to experiment with virtuality and ways of embodiment and bringing people together. So she also has another performance called Mirror Dwellers, where again, she's exploring this idea of the virtual avatar and the ways that we transmute ourselves as performers into other spaces and other forms. And so we're kind of getting into this XR modality. And so we've, again, wanted to collaborate for a long time. And so we're also thinking about the creation of not only these hyper instrument type of performance environments, again, where you can project different parameters of your body and your sound into other spaces, but also looking at the therapeutic potential of these. And so here's, again, using this computer vision model and using a hand pose estimation model. And we're looking at using this to be able to do things like identify biomechanical inefficiencies, being able to create predictive models for overuse injuries, potentially. You could probably extend this to typing, right? Came up with a computer vision model to prevent yourself from getting carpal tunnel syndrome. But also another thing that we want to be able to do with this, and by the way, we also want to be able to use this in practice environments. So you can have this algorithm that's, again, score informed and looking at ways of saying, okay, we're analyzing how you might have some sort of problem spot in this piece that you're practicing. And it could actually do real-time generation of etudes, right, or materials to help you practice to get through that spot. This is a diagram of the way that pitches are mapped to various fingerings on the flute. These are kind of the ones that you learn when you're first learning how to play the flute, but unfortunately there are a lot of things called alternate fingerings, and so you have to have this entire database. So that's one of the corpora that we're working with in addition to the score. So again, you have your pose estimation, you have your live audio signal, that then gets compared to a score, some sort of reference audio, and then that would generate a new score, new reference audio, and give potentially haptic feedback to the musician. So it can say, okay, it's your ring finger, right? That's causing the problem. Maybe adjust it in this specific way. And so, of course, then you revise your score, and then you revise. So you get these very interesting feedback loops. There are other feedback loops that we could put in here as well. And so these are just some of the ways that, again, we are returning data to the body that we are extracting, right? In a way of hopefully, again, improving somebody's quality of life, preventing injuries, and giving them a more holistic experience. Another thing that's from this pedagogical aspect that's very interesting is that when you're teaching someone how to make music, particularly as a performer, obviously you can like physically manipulate the student. That's definitely a really fraught territory. And obviously there have been a lot of conversations happening about this in recent news, right? There are a lot of really treacherous territories in terms of consent and trust. But what's also very interesting about these things is that oftentimes teachers have to use words. And so you're saying, I was talking with some folks about this yesterday, right? We're looking at ways of saying, okay, that pitch is too high, that pitch is too low. And like sometimes you actually do sit there with a tuner and you can figure out how many hertz it's high, how you need to adjust the signal that way. But oftentimes we'll use much more qualitative words, talking about expressivity, talking about mood, and it gets very difficult to actually pin down the manifestations of that in the physical engagement with the instrument. I remember when I used to teach voice lessons, and it was very interesting. I would teach them to other MIT students, and then I had students outside of MIT, and it was so fascinating to think about the ways that I would have to communicate that. The other thing that's really hard about voice, right? It's an internalized, embodied instrument, right? You can have people stand in a mirror and practice, but you can't say like, okay, you need to raise your soft palate by 2 millimeters in order to create this, right? That's not how people learn how to sing. Although it is funny when you talk to engineers and you try to teach them how to sing. They do appreciate that. I appreciated it when I was going through vocal training. So in any case, how do we circumvent this? And I think this is one way that we're potentially able to bridge that gap. We've been talking about, again, how do we bridge these gaps? How do we return data? Now, okay, is that going to work with pieces like this? There's a long way that we need to go. When it comes to complexity. This is a piece called Unity Capsule by a composer named Brian Ferneyhough. This is part of the new complexity movement of composition. Much more complex than Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. Yes, it's fully notated. But good luck coming up with the data structure to parametrize all of this in a really intuitive way. So Ina's actually a specialist in Brian Ferneyhough's music. She did her dissertation he has this whole cycle of flute works. He actually was a flutist, which is why he can notate and prescribe the types of information that he wants to such a level of detail. But in any case, again, we look at data structures, and for music, they just simply do not exist yet to a degree that would allow you to combine them all in this much more comprehensive way. Okay, so in terms of the force feedback, we are starting to get into using gloves. You can see that she had gloves as part of her mocap suit. These are the Rococo gloves. This is attached to an Arduino to do data handling. I would love to get gloves like this. For these force feed. It's like an exoskeleton, right, that we were looking at yesterday. Yeah, you can pre-order one for $15,000, but yeah, unfortunately, I can't even get a new laptop, so definitely not gonna get me a pair of $15,000 gloves. If anybody wants to, let me know. My birthday's coming up. So in any case, yeah, we would love to be able to get these much more rich data streams. And I think this is where we start to get into these conversations about data compression, data parametrization, and discretization. And it's like, how rich and continuous of a data stream do you need to have for these types of augmentations to not just be proxies, where we're still running into the same types of issues that we are. If we're parametrizing it to language, we're just making those issues on a smaller scale, but they're still there. So another way that we're looking at engaging with these specific paradigms is looking at therapeutics for diseases that often come with aging, particularly things that affects people's neuromotor abilities. So this is a still from a documentary called Alive Inside from 2014 about music therapy with Alzheimer's patients. And so one of the therapeutic interventions that is most commonly used is passive listening, right? And you can get amazing, amazing results. I don't know how many people have ever had a family member with Alzheimer's, but I have, and it's really, really incredible to see the way in which music can help with emotional regulation and just lucidity, helping people be there in the moment. Engaging with memory, engaging with these historical threads, hysteresis, helping give them some peace at the end of life. But we're looking at ways of potentially being able to do more. The other thing that's really interesting about the situation is because a lot of music therapy stems from empirical or anecdotal investigations, it's not really well funded. Again, I know I'm talking about the paucity of funding in music, so I hate to keep hitting on that point, but it is really true, right? Whenever you approach a scientist or an engineer, and remember, I come from science and engineering, so I know how this goes, they say, show me the data. We don't have the data because we don't have the funding to do the studies to get the data. And so it's very interesting because now we're using data extraction as a way of being able to actually try to repair these connections that are being lost, literally and figuratively, but also engaging with the capitalist structures, right, that dictate what gets funding and what doesn't. So one potential way of doing this is thinking about, again, incentivization of rhythmic activity. The few studies that are out there that are starting to, the few studies that are out there are starting to show that if you can incentivize rhythmic activity, you can actually increase neuroplasticity. It's also better in terms of emotional regulation, development of fine and gross motor skills. And so there's a lot of different paradigms for this if you're kind of making these computer vision models for music generation. But one thing that I think is really important is also thinking about the rhythmic aspect here. So you can control tempo with things like this. I, for a very long time, had actually, like with an installation with Jellyfish back in 2015, I did work with like motion tracking and controlling the tempo of different types of sound files. But what's very interesting here is you can kind of allow the person to move their way beat by beat through a sound file by actually controlling this with rhythmic activity. And so again, how do we embody these data structures and create these translational modes of interaction that ultimately get you back in this loop? So again, body snatching. How do we think about trying to return this data to the body? Now I have to get back to my notes. So again, we've talked about proxies. We're talking about virtual avatars, and not all patients in this case are going to have the same range of mobility, and so we have to respect the capabilities of all bodies. We have to design tools in this way, and when we look at all of the biases inherent in a lot of these systems, right, there's actually not a lot of tools that are trained on Alzheimer's patients or people with ALS or Parkinson's. And so there was a study, I don't have the citation, but it was actually a poster at AI Days 2 weeks ago, where a student from, I don't remember the program, I should have written this down. I didn't write it down. It's called AP, I think it's Applied Physiology and Kinesiology, had actually looked at bias against patients with neuromotor deficiencies in open source models like MediaPipe. Right? So again, we have to think about how the current data structures need to be either heavily fine-tuned or thrown out altogether and revised to be able to be suited for these specific use cases. And again, language. The language, unfortunately, is not there. When we think about speech recognition, automatic speech recognition and text-to-speech synthesis, Google actually has a project called Project Relate, where people with neuromotor conditions that affect their speech patterns are able to contribute recordings to be able to train speech synthesis models and automatic speech recognition models on their particular speech patterns, which can be really great in terms of allowing them to create virtual communication assistants. It can kind of free them from having to have an actual human communication assistant to travel with them, which can be very, very costly. And unfortunately, because of the lack of disability funding in the US, it can be very hard to access those resources. And so that's another example of how we can think about data structures in these reparative ways, right? And thinking about how people embody these data structures in their own way, rather than this generalized capitalistic model of discretizing the body, you know, in a non-universal way. We were talking about universality earlier, right? I would argue that many of these things are not universal. And it's these cases where we really, really need to focus on repairing the structural harms that are caused via these systems. So I guess at the end of the day, one of the things that I'm interested in doing is thinking outside of the box of data compression, thinking outside of the box of discretization, right? We have so much focus on working with developing these systems, but of course they have these biases inherent in them, embodied in those corpora. And so, again, trying to engage these tools in liberating narratives as opposed to oppressive ones. And so what would it look like if instead of prioritizing efficiency and optimization, we prioritize those structures, right? These smooth curves, this analog nature, these continuities that exist in human experience in terms of thinking about how we engage with corpora. So, thank you. Yes.
No, it's all right.
It's all good. listen, I'm someone who works in audio, so I appreciate.
Can you talk a little bit more? You said that you did a lot of research or maybe learning more about how instruments and maybe composing can be translated into AI or translated into devices so we could become more like effective at that. What are some other ways other than like transposing to become more of an effective player or composer? What are some of the other ways that that could be applied, I guess, through the lens of like music? I don't know. It's kind of like an open-ended question.
Yeah, no worries. That's my job.
Okay.
That's what I love about these conversations. Again, as I said, this is like very nascent work, so I'm happy to be able to dream and imagine through these questions with all of you. And again, awesome to be in a very different community than the people I normally talk to. But that's a really fantastic question. I think one of the ways that's been already happening for a long time, if you've ever used Spotify, right, or you've ever used Apple Music, there's all kinds of different ways that they parametrize the music, and they construct their data sets to be able to power their recommendation algorithms, right? And so sure, there's a lot to be said about emotional regulation that might be related to that. Obviously, they want to make it personalized, which is kind of what we've been talking about here. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be a profit-seeking motive. And then when we also look at, again, the biases in those algorithms, yesterday you brought up danceability, right? Okay, so danceability is one of these parameters within the Spotify API, which is so nebulous. Actually, is one of the assignments in that computational music theory class I mentioned. I try to make my students reverse engineer it. Right? Because in the documentation, they don't actually tell you. They're like, oh, it's, this index from 0 to 1, and we consider these types of things, like rhythmic regularity is one of them, the impulse response, so in terms of, the dynamic range between. So is there like a really legible, steady beat, right, that you can pick up on? It also looks at the tempo. If it's like way too fast, you can't dance to it. If it's way too slow, you can't dance to it. So if I look at like my music or I look at Xenakis's music, the danceability rating is probably going to be really low, according to Spotify. I don't know. I think it slaps, but in any case, so that's kind of one way that this information is being used. I would argue that that's a really gross, not gross in terms of like ew, but like just not fine-grained way of being able to parametrize the act of human engagement with music, right? And again, also goes to the concept of large language models. You're saying, okay, I'm saying that there's this one parameter that I'm calling danceability. The other thing that I think is super interesting when it comes to streaming algorithms is vibes. How many of you have ever like played a playlist that's like chill vibes? So there's a lot of theory that's starting to come about the vibe economy, right? And where do we get the word vibe? Vibrations, right? And so it's very interesting. There's a philosopher and musician named Robin James who works a lot on this concept of the vibe, right? And the relationship of vibe to some sort of shared notion, an attempt at universality of what constitutes a vibe. How is the vibe traded with, right? How do we, again, make this some sort of product that can be bought and sold in service of capitalist intents? And so, in any case, sorry, I'm like spinning out. That said, there's other ways that you can use these modalities as well. So one of the things that I'm like, I don't think there's any IFAS people in the room, the agriculture program. One of the programs one of the projects that I really want to take on, in my copious amounts of spare time, is actually looking at the timbral distribution. So parametrizing kind of the relationship of the different frequency components within a sound of beehives to be able to predict colony collapse events. And so I feel like there are all these different ways where you can translate this unique relationship to sound that a lot of like not only trained musicians, but just as humans who consume music all the time have. And we can use these things to solve not only our day-to-day problems of like, what do I listen to, but also how do we engage with sound to like literally save the world. So sorry to make that like super high-minded. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but yeah. Oh. I was like, I don't know if I'm supposed to pick who goes next. Okay, Carla does, okay.
This will be all my scattered comments on the many things that you showed, but I wonder, I just finished a book called An Immense World. Has anyone seen it? It's really about how other creatures sense the
Oh,
world or
yes.
see the world. And one of the interesting things about it is it points out that a lot of animals, creatures, ways of sensing are tuned to what they need to sense.
Yes.
And that filters out a lot of data right ahead of time. And so when I was looking at you trying to make sense out of a conductor, I'm thinking, okay, what do I need to see? And what do I need to understand? And so are there ways that you can choose the kind of way that you look at the conductor or even dress the conductor in a certain way that certain things are more visible and that you could thin slice it?
Right.
So it's not a wireframe. And my real question is, why did you choose the wireframing version versus something else, which, you know, thin slicing in psychology gives you an emotional reading, and that might be more important than the actual position of things or the face.
Right. The short answer is lack of resources. Like lack of resources, lack of time, you know, this is just what I had available. But that is a really fantastic question, right? And it's essentially, like, this was a very, you know, again, not fine-grained approach to this. But when we look at how do humans communicate emotion, right? Facial features. So we would have to have these like heuristic ways of segmenting that. And I think the other thing when we're talking about these force feedback mechanisms and haptic modes of engagement, we also have to be practical about the realities of performance, right? And the fact that like most conductors don't want to be wearing a mocap suit. They don't want to be wearing gloves. There is a company, oh, I'm blanking on the name, that made a baton that actually has like gyroscopes and everything in it. And so that's able to kind of control some sorts of haptic feedback mechanisms. But here's the thing, most choral conductors don't use batons. Right. And so there's that assumption, right, that there's this mode of engaging with technology that is just inherent to the practice, and it's not. And so, yeah, there's an enormous amount of information, and it's hard to sift through to really define what exactly is the thing that is most communicative.
What we do, it's very selective about what it sees, and that
Right.
makes the camera more cost effective and makes the computation less intense.
Right.
So
And the other thing
maybe
that we,
some-
oh,
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing to take into account when we talk about like power structures and agency is also how information is communicated within the ensemble versus from the conductor. And that's something that I think a lot of people are starting to challenge now. It's led to a lot of abuse and very, very problematic situations throughout history. And so people are starting to think about how we can reimagine that. Like the field of conducting, I'm like, if people watch this online later, I'm probably going to get some hate mail, which is actually evidence of the point I'm about to make, is the fact that I think by and large, the field of conducting in particular, particularly pedagogy, trades in abuse and creating an abusive situation. How many of you saw Tar? Right? Like, you know, it's okay. Anyway, it's terrible. It's like, anyway, just like don't watch it. But it really makes fun of this like intensely abusive environment in which people with like very, very, they have to be very charismatic, right? They have to have very big personalities to be able to project that information. Or they often do. I'm not saying they need to, but sometimes that can go hand in hand with other notions of power and agency. And so I think that that's something that's also very, very important within these conversations. I don't know how we create a data set for that. You know, so that's another element of this that I tend to think a lot about in my work, but I have no answers. I have no answers.
One other suggestion, just from the UF perspective, since you're new, there are a number of groups about healthcare that
Yes. Oh yeah.
put together collaborative, like from all different units. I'm hoping you've explored those and like, so because going after grants, their funding may be more than adequate,
Oh yes.
and they may need your
Yep.
idea.
Yep. So yeah, we're in the process of trying to look for like NIH, NIS, NSF, NIA funding. I'm consulting for a company now. Don't worry, for all the UF people listening, it's it's been totally okayed by the Conflict of Interest Program. But there's an awesome company that's actually founded by a UF alum, a bunch of UF alums, called Outlier Technology. And they're working with a lot of these neurorehabilitative platforms, particularly with Alzheimer's and autism as well, thinking about this idea of communication. And so, they've gotten, I think, over $800,000 of funding from the NIA's SBIR grant program. And so the resources are there, but obviously it takes a lot of time. And actually, ironically, like right after this, I have to run to a College of the Arts mixer with the School of Public Health. So I'm going to run there, and then I'm going to come back. So I'm sorry to miss the next talk, maybe talk and a half. But in any case, yeah, it's building these bridges is tough. It's tough. Again, structures. We think of structures. Everybody likes to be siloed off, and so trying to build these bridges. Right? Trying to navigate and anyway, can be tough.
Thank you for your talk. I had a question regarding, on one hand, there is this moment that you addressed about how Spotify and its algorithms are kind of so clumsy in indexing music, and yet they kind of work apparently for the Spotify users. Mm-hmm. But then I was wondering, recently there was this song that came out by Fake Drake.
Don't even get me started.
And I'm wondering, this kind of, it seems that like these models that are able to produce these kind of things, they have a completely different and more fine-grained way of working with things than these, 8 parameters that Spotify is working. So how do you see this kind of field of generative music that is probably to some extent also building on some of the neural net architectures that we also see present in LLMs, but of course are not working in the same way as LLMs because they're not trained on that kind of corpus.
Right. Yeah. So that's a fantastic question. I'm like, I should send you. I have 2-hour-long lecture modules for my for my current Quest course on just that from last week. So, but yes, and actually that's a similar type of synthesis that I used in my piece, like at the very beginning. But this was like a number of years ago, so it's nowhere near as good as what we're capable of doing now. So yeah, a lot of those algorithms, particularly using like real-time, the RAVE algorithm. It's real-time audio variational autoencoders. And so a lot of these are getting so good at capturing this data. And in terms of doing this timbre transfer process and mapping the timbral characteristics of someone's voice onto the expressive patterns of somebody else's voice. I will say, I don't think it's quite there yet. And when we're talking about bias, there are some issues as well when we think about sampling rate. So this goes way back. We're going to take a trip in the Wayback Machine all the way to the Radio Act of 1927, in which Congress said that we are capping the bandwidth of AM radio at 10,000 hertz, which, as I'm sure everyone knows, AM radio, unless it's single sideband AM radio, basically doubles the bandwidth of the signal. So what that means is that your baseband signal is only 5,000 hertz. 5,000 hertz is not enough frequency space to be able to capture the higher frequency components related to sibilants and various types of consonants, right? And so what was super interesting is back in the 1920s when radio was becoming popular in the US, everybody was like, I can't hear what women are saying. We're not gonna let women be on the radio. But because that 5,000 hertz limit was put into law, it has stuck around. And so, for instance, if you look at a lot of speech synthesis tools, the sampling rate is 10,000 hertz. We're getting better. And I think like Google's Music LM model is, I believe, 24, it might be 48K. It might be 48K, and then that means, you have the sampling rate to get the actual maximum frequency that can be represented. But so we're getting better. But I will say what's super interesting about a lot of these algorithms is they're biased. They're biased. Also, when we look at compression algorithms, particularly if you're working with video and audio, it's going to favor the video, right? And so you're going to get rid of a lot of that, what they call high frequency energy that people think is not necessarily as important. Oh, we were talking about that idea of filtering for things that are important. there's a great example of this in terms of measurement apparatus and different decibel ratings. So when we go, actually as architects, I'm sure many of you might know about this. So there's different sound pressure level decibel ratings. So for instance, if we took a decibel meter and like rolled up next to our construction equipment out there, you have like, it's SPL A, B, C, like Z, there's a bunch of them. Some of them are designed to be more perceptually relevant. And so as humans, we tend to be more sensitive to higher frequency sounds within, between about like 1,000 hertz and 7,000 hertz, because that's where warning calls are, babies crying, right? We want to be able to respond to those sounds very quickly because otherwise you die or something you care about dies. And so it's very interesting to look at the ways that influences how we think of sonic health. I'm getting far afield of your question, I'm sorry, but I went back to your question because I forgot to mention this. And so it's very interesting is when, not engineers, when regulators go out and measure SPL levels in communities that are trying to get public funding for noise abatement, one of the patterns is that they've actually used the decibel ratings, I believe it's SPL-A decibel rating system that actually doesn't take into account low frequencies because they're like, oh, humans don't really hear those. They don't care about those. What creates a lot of low frequency components? Airports, highways, trains. And so again, we think about like bias in the measurement mechanisms that we use, right? And so those things are kind of inherent. And I've gotten very far away from your question. I'm so sorry. But yeah, I guess I got on that because of compression algorithms. And but I was going to say those models with voice cloning oftentimes do not work as well for high voices. You get a lot more distortion in higher frequency ranges, which can be really good for some singers. That's actually can be a plus. But what's really funny, so Meta released a model called AudioGen last year, and all of their examples that they posted, I think it's still a preprint, all of the examples that they posted, not all of them, except for one that had speech in them, were all of lower voiced individuals. So in that context, because they only were working with a gender binary, again, thinking about bias inherent in data structures, whose bodies, whose identities, whose experiences of life are not being represented. But anyway, all of them were coded as male in that data set. There was one instance of female speech. Anyway, sorry. I love that. That's a whole other conversation for another time. And they said that they chose those based upon the fact that those were the highest quality examples. And it's like, I wonder why. Those are the highest quality examples. So in any case, I'm being a little bit snarky right now, but yeah.
Another question we have over here.
Yes. Thanks a lot for this fascinating talk, by the way. I have a question regarding the way we train models in the music industry. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have the feeling that everything is trained on the music itself. I mean, by the music itself, I mean the spectrum, or I mean physical data.
Not always.
But do we train model? Does Spotify, for example, or I mean some other firms, train models on this kind of notational document that we saw from Xenakis or other person like that?
Definitely not Xenakis.
Because you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
What I mean is that my feeling is that a partition by Xenakis carries an amount of information which is fundamentally different from what the musical played. I mean, what the music once it's played,
Yes.
carries. I mean, in one side, it's about language, real language, and on another side, it's pure physics.
Yes. Yep.
So let's say, why do we keep talking about language when we train things on purely physical data? Because there's nothing linguistic when we train a model on sound as a physical output, let's say.
Right. So to answer your question, the vast majority of these sorts of models, we're now starting to get to models that are actually looking at like the audio signal itself. Many of them prior to this, again, because of this idea of like efficiency and optimization have to do something called music information retrieval to do the feature extraction. And so we're essentially limiting the amount of data that's associated with an audio file. So there's a ton of different features that people look for, some of which are, scientific in nature and come from engineering, some of which are danceability from Spotify. Or energy or valence are two other ones that Spotify uses that do not release the definition of those. And so particularly when it comes to pitch, right, and quantization of pitch, that's actually it's an interesting conversation in terms of defining what pitch is, what is in tune, these sorts of things. Because sure, you can say it's analog frequency space, right? There's infinitely many pitches, but the vast majority of these models are looking at Western classical 12-tone equal tempered systems of pitch quantization. And so you might have an audio signal, and obviously as someone sings, there's gonna be vibrato, right? And if it's a really wide vibrato or somebody's sliding, the vast majority of the models that currently exist are not going to capture that nuance. It's going to be like, okay, they ended up at this pitch. So that's what the pitch is. Or this is in the key of D major, right? Regardless of whether or not it's a tonal piece of music. Some of them are now being able to say, oh, I can't identify the key, but even the assumption that it's in a key is a problem, right? And so yes, it should all theoretically come from that audio signal, but again, because of the necessity to compress based upon optimization and efficiency within these capitalist structures, right? That's what they're looking at. Also tempo and beat. The majority of the music we listen to, I would argue, or the sounds that we experience on a daily basis are not just locked in this static grid, but that's what the majority of these models assume. And so also thinking about larger scale structure and repetition, this is something that has not been covered adequately at all in any of these text to music models that we see popping up. The vast majority of them just give you this really silly thing. And like Music LM from Google is trying to do it, but if you go and work with it in their, what is it called, the AI test kitchen, I think Google has, it's so bad. And talking about vibes, it's hilarious. I'm like, I wish I had the screenshot for you. I have it somewhere on my computer because I took it when I first opened it up. They were like, try describing the music that you want by like talking about the vibe or the mood. And you're like, okay, I'm sorry, for me in terms of my compositional process and the vast majority of musicians I know who are involved with actually creating the music, right? Like, yeah, that's something that we think about, but when it comes down to the mechanics of construction, that is not at all what is involved in the process. We have to translate that into the physical characteristics of it, but that's not what the data sets are capturing right now. So, sorry, that was a very long-winded response to that. Are we done? Yeah. I was like, I don't want to take up too much time.
No, I mean, it's super fascinating. I mean, thank you so much. I mean, you were worried maybe whether you fit into this scheme. I think it fits perfectly, and I'm super grateful.
Well, thank you guys for having me.
So my question is like, okay, I kind of know a little bit about how machine learning are trying to work with music. I know that they work with MIDI files and that they work on some of this on the spectrograms. Now I'm curious about, because you said you needed a low latency, which means probably you're going to work on the amplitude level, no?
So a lot of it does have to do with amplitude, yes. And so this is what we're trying to figure out. Right?
But my question is, in that context, what is your frame window? Because it's really different if it's 1 millisecond or if it's 5 or if it's 10 or if it's 30 seconds. How do we address that?
Do you want me to show you right now? I'm like, I don't know if I can get the screen back. I will show you literally right now this problem because we deal with this all the time. So, okay, here's a program called Sonic Visualizer. Free program, by the way. You can go, I think it comes from like King's College London. I can't remember. But anyway, if you Google it, you'll find it. So in any case, I don't know, let's find an audio file. Sorry, I'm like, oh man, where is one? I know, you're gonna see my entire structure. You're gonna see, okay, here's me speaking. I made my students train voice cloning models on their voices last week in my undergrad. Why? Oh, because I'm not connected to the internet. Okay, that's why. Sorry, y'all. I don't want to take up more time. I know we're like probably way over. We're good. Okay, this will take me like another 30 seconds, I hope, to show. Okay, Finder, give it to me. It's only 2 megabytes, come on. What is happening? What about this one? It's probably gonna do the same thing. The first one's done, okay. Thanks, UF Wi-Fi. Okay, all right, so here's our waveform, right? And you can see essentially what this is, if you've never looked at a waveform, is the amplitude of the signal. We're not really seeing anything about frequency information, except if you zoom in, you can see. Okay, so if I add a layer in here, we can look at the spectrogram of this audio signal. And this is where you see basically we go from frequency information on the y-axis, and we have time on the x-axis, and then the color map has to do with the amplitude, the intensity. All right, so I'm going to zoom in. This is a sound file of me speaking. I'm going to zoom in down to these lower frequencies so that you can see this a little bit better. So these frequencies, you can see up in that right-hand corner, maybe not, that it tells you like the approximate pitch. But you can see that these bands are like kind of wide with my, you might not be able to see because it's really far away. But in any case, if I want to increase the pitch discrimination, I have to take a larger window size because I need more data to be able to average it for the fast Fourier transform to work. So if I pick a larger window size, you see that those bands get much narrower, right? And I have much better pitch discernment. And so choosing this, but the thing is, it's way smearier now in the time domain. And so now I've lost my temporal resolution for the sake of pitch discrimination. And this is the constant balancing act that has to happen. And this actually goes to your question about the pure physics of it, right? Yeah, it's a physical analog phenomenon out in the air here as we're experiencing it, or if you're feeling vibrations in like a physical medium, like sound is just wiggles. At the end of the day, it's just wiggles, right? You can break it into infinitely many sinusoids of different amplitudes. So in any case, you lose, it's a constant balancing act. And so as these algorithms try to do feature extraction and figure out what that pitch information is, which by the way, we're talking about language, one of the things that I find is funny. So if you look at the pitches, I'm sure many of you are familiar with like the pitches, they're like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, right? And so we use like letter names in the majority of like Western classical music or traditions that stem from it to talk about. Anyway, I find that an interesting case. But yeah, it's tough. It's really, really tough. And so when we think about low latency, we have to think about window size and how what that trade-off is. And it's context dependent. It depends on the type of music. When we're talking about computer vision, like I'm trying to get a high frame rate camera so that we can get much better resolution that way. So in any case, yeah, it's tough. It's computationally intensive.
It seems that this is kind of a real problem.
Yeah.
Because obviously, if you have the sound file in advance, you can take all the window sizes. But if you're doing something real time,
Yes.
this is really the limit of continuity. This is the
Yep.
problem, continuity versus discrete.
Yep.
Which not many people understand is that in real time, you cannot do any
Right.
window size. You have to keep it.
Yep. I'm going to show you. So this is that software that I told you about before called Pure Data. And Pure Data, I don't think I can increase the size of this, actually allows you to set what's called the block size, which is essentially this window size, and the delay in milliseconds. And so 64, if we do like 64 divided by, I believe my sample rate, what's 40? Yeah, 44 1K. That's like what, 1 point something milliseconds, right? Yeah, that might be the delay between the in and the out in the processing. However, like my computer can't handle that. maybe when UF gets me a new laptop. No, I'm just kidding, right? But still, particularly if you're doing anything that's computationally intensive in terms of indexing other data sets, indexing a score, correlating with computer vision, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And so, yeah, like I say all these things about how do we think more analog with these data structures, but we still do have to navigate these problems. But part of me is also just like, again, this stems from an entire history of discretized thinking. And I'm like, what if we imagined a completely different history where we thought in more analog terms? So I don't know. It's just a fun thought experiment.
Can I very quickly add something? I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. It seems to me that all we are speaking about mostly here, in a way or another, is signal analysis and signal processing, right?
Yep.
But here, conceptually speaking, and this is why, but I'm very interested in music, even if I'm not a musician myself, but conceptually speaking, I think there's something fundamentally different when we speak about music and when we speak about, for example, I don't know, literature or mathematics. Because when we speak about literature, the words are not translated into something else than the words themselves. I mean, you know, it's about you write something, you make use of language, and the person who reads it reads the language. I mean, he does not read the sound. Okay, maybe in poetry.
Yeah.
Maybe. Okay.
I was gonna say, yeah.
But in most cases, you read the semantics. I mean, you read words that are exactly the same as the words that were written by the author, and you are interested in the semantics. You are not interested in the physicality of the signal when someone pronounces the sound or whatever. In mathematics, it's the same. I mean, when you write an equation and when you make use of the symbol pi or the exponential or whatever, in fact, the meaning you convey, the semantics of the exponential is the exponential. It's not translated into the sound signal of the exponential. And here in music, my feeling is that there's really a kind of epistemological, you know, like barrier or I mean, for me, it's fundamentally different from language, I mean, literature, mathematics, or things like that, because suddenly we fall into a category which has absolutely nothing to do with, for example, the sign on the partition or whatever, which is again about signal processing. So there is this process of translation which does not exist when we deal with mathematics, when we deal with even in physics, even in mathematical physics, we don't really care about the ultimately about the physicality of the symbol, of the physical constant. You know, like the Planck constant, for example. I mean, we know it's a dimension, but I mean, nobody really pays attention to the physical translation.
One thing
so here in music, it's weird because we speak about something while we analyze. I mean, we speak about musical concept in a sense, while in fact, what we analyze is everything except concept. It's again, it's signal.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly why I've kind of like, as I've gotten deeper and deeper into AI, have felt this frustration, right, in terms of the way that we have conventionally thought about structuring data, because there is this inherent disconnect between the physical reality of experiencing music and creating it and thinking about the organizational structures with which we curate relationships between different sounds. Because I think that's another part of it too. It's ultimately, well, when we're talking about music as opposed to just sound, it is relational. We have to think about not necessarily units of meaning, because like, what does it even mean, right? It's what we associate with it. It's relativistic. I once took a music and meaning class, and this was one of the things that the teacher started out with, is he was like, what does a chair mean? I was like, that's pretty good. But when we think about like different types of sounds and sound source identification, the sonic object itself is often related to the sound source. We think of it in terms of the sound source and the physical properties of the thing that made that source, right? So again, we're indexing it by embodiment, as opposed to this mediated or translated process. But in terms of the thing about literature, I would be interested to hear people's perspective on, when you read words, do you hear is the wrong word. Do you audiate or perceive it as in a voice in your head?
Maybe, but even if this happens, let's say, the meaning does not change, or the meaning is not really influenced by that. I mean, if you listen to a story, if you are a kid, if you listen to a story read by your grandmother or your mother or your father, etc., ultimately it remains the same story, you know. While I mean, even if the voice is changing, even if it's pronounced by somebody who cannot pronounce the words extremely well or whatever, But in music, of course, if you change the
Yeah,
sound,
no, it's
then,
like
I mean, you
different
change,
thing. Yeah,
you
yeah,
change
yeah.
the product.
Yeah, yes.
So
I
this
agree
is
with
this is the difference I make.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
on one side, the semantics is associated with the word itself in a way which is completely independent from the pronunciation or the tone, etc. Again, maybe except in poetry, which is a very specific
Right.
domain.
Motive, yeah.
But in music, the sound, the reality of the sound ultimately is everything. I mean, that's maybe even what we call music. I mean, otherwise it would be literature, or
Right.
otherwise, if the partition by Xenakis would be to be read rather than to be played, maybe it would just be mathematical notation. So you see what I mean?
He has in his book Formalized Music, he actually shows the Fortran code that he's using,
Yeah,
which I love.
I
You
read
have
it.
that, yeah.
It's a beautiful book.
I
And
know,
I
I
also
love
saw, maybe you saw it also, the exhibition on the Xenakis that was displayed like 2 years ago at the
Oh yes, the
Museum.
centenary. Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
then
yeah.
it traveled
Yes.
to Athens and to a couple of.
I didn't get to see it, but yeah, because he was born in, I believe, 1922, so it was the centenary last year.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
a very beautiful exhibition.
I wish
With
I
lots
could
of
have seen it.
Original
Yeah.
partitions and
Yeah.
amazing.
I wish I could have seen that. Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. There is like a fundamentally like domain specificity about kind of some of the issues that I have to run up against that are not necessarily present. Yeah, I guess I'll just say not necessarily present in other fields, and so it does make it tough. But we have to. I do think ultimately, kind of what is at the heart of some of my frustrations or feelings of being like stretched or pulled is that when we look at the people who are generally involved in making the data structures, right? Unfortunately, it's not the people who are necessarily making the thing. So for instance, when we look at large language models for I feel like I'm taking up too much time. I'm happy to chat more. I have to run to the public health event as suggested, but I'll come back. I'll be back. Yeah. So thank you, everyone. Thank you.